this is part of this event that we're having today is part of a future literacy series that we started. It's a collaboration between Collective Future and Speculative Futures LA. And I'm the founder of Collective Future. It's an innovation and design studio that's based here in Los Angeles. And we use, for those of you who don't know us, we use future visioning and storytelling and human-centered design to help people, mainly our clients, imagine what's possible in the future. And I'm also one of the organizers of Speculative Futures LA, and we actually have we have a new group of co-organizers who are on the call with us. So we'll introduce them a little bit later. And so we started this series because I think over the last few months, there's been a lot of conversation around like, what is our future? You know, what are we supposed to do? How do we deal with it? I mean, I feel like this idea of the future is more present in everyone's minds than ever. And there's a lot of amazing practices that have been really working in this space for a long time, but I'm not sure that people always understand or know about these different kinds of practices. And so for our community and for people who are really interested, we wanted to start this future literacy series, which is what we do is we invite different experts and practitioners to come and to share about the work that they've been doing, to talk a little bit about it in a really more, both in theoretical and in practical ways. Probably the number one question we always get is, how can I make a living doing this kind of work? And we're gonna ask Jörgen that question as well. And so it's really a great, real pleasure for us to have Jörgen with us today, and a couple other people from Minkowski, including Joris and my screen. Alexander, yes. Yeah, and I actually first encountered Jorgen at another event. It was with the Columbia DSL, the Digital Storytelling Lab, and he was doing an event there, and there was lots of other people, and I was super interested and impressed in what he was saying in the way of working, and I knew other people would be interested. And so I wanted to invite him to come and speak with us in our community as well. So I'm not going to do too much of an introduction. I'll just say that Jorgen is the founder of Minkowski. They've been around since 2017, but Jorgen has been doing this kind of work since 2004. So he's got a long and storied background in this space. And really, I'm going to let Jorgen, I'm going to turn it over to him because I think he'll do a much better job of explaining a little bit about who he is and his background. And just a quick note to everyone, so we are recording this session, and if you could just kind of stay on mute, if you wouldn't mind, that would be great. That will give the presenter a chance to present. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat, and we'll be just sort of checking questions throughout, and we'll leave some time for Q&A definitely at the end. So Jörgen, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours. I think you're on mute.
Yes, I am.
There you are.
I said I think that you have to stop screen sharing so that I can share my screen. But let me start with saying thank you for the invitation. It is always nice to meet people that are in this field and that are kind of like working to get speculative futures or futures thinking into a better position, and people studying it and trying to figure out how you can make it work. And I think that the initiative of doing this and sharing these practices is very good, because I don't think that there's one way to approach this and there's one way to work with people in this domain. But you can learn a lot from these shared experiences. So I will do my best to share how we are approaching that at Minkowski. And like Ronni said at the start, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat window so that we can answer them. And I know that we have time until 1 p.m. LA time, which is about 10 p.m. European time, and whatever other time zones are present. So we'll make sure that you can leave by that time, but I have more time for people that are hanging in there for additional questions if you have that. So just wanted everyone to know, because I'm also here to answer as many questions as possible, of course, from all of you. We also wanted to make it a little bit more interactive, this talk. There's not just me talking and talking and talking, but we'll ask you a couple of questions throughout the presentation as well. We'll use the polling function for it in Zoom. And if you're not familiar with that, a poll question will pop to your screen at certain moments. And it would be awesome if you could fill it out. And we've designed these questions and the moments when you get these questions a little bit based on our approach to help you think a little bit about, what is happening in the future and how you can turn that into action. So those were just a couple of words before, so that you know what's going to happen in the next, 40 minutes or something. So we are Minkowski, and we're a collective of practitioners that collaborate in various projects. We're all trainers, coaches, facilitators, designers, strategists, and students of this field as well. And we are a collection or an ecosystem, so you will, to work on specific projects for clients. We are called Minkowski Agency for Applied Futures, but the word agency in our tagline is not there because we are a traditional agency as a corporate or an organizational structure. We see agency more in the meaning of the word giving agency to people to act in a certain environment. And for us, that agency is to act from a futures perspective. And these are the people that we collaborate with on a regular basis. We are named after this guy, Hermann Minkowski. And Hermann Minkowski was one of Einstein's teachers. And that is why we really liked to name ourselves after him, because he, of course, also had that facilitating, that teaching, that enabling energy or function. In 1907, he gave a famous speech in Vienna called Raum und Zeit in German, Space and Time, in which he kind of put a mathematical framework around Einstein's theory on special relativity. A lot of attention was put on Einstein's work at that time, but that was not, I think, the most important thing. What was more important for Einstein himself is that he came to realize with the work that Minkowski had done, that he could turn his special theory in a general theory of relativity. And the rest is history, as they then say. And that is also our corporate company slogan, making history by changing the future. That is what we help organizations with, to actually change their course and direction going forward. We're also named after Minkowski because he had a very nice perspective on time and space, of course, based on that famous speech that he gave. And I'm just going to share that because we have adapted kind of like his way of looking at the future in our work. What he said is that where a particle can end up in the future is determined by where it's coming from, so where it's been in the past and where it is today. And there's only a limited set of possible new positions that this particle can take in the future. It cannot travel faster than light, it cannot go back in time, so there's a limited set of possibilities. And he called that the cone of possibilities, or officially the light cone of possibility. And we've taken that framework or this way of looking at the future and how you determine future positions in our work with clients. And we help them map possibilities for themselves in the future. And not all possibilities or all positions in the future are possible, even though organizations might think everything is possible. They might think that, with all these technology, the sky is the limit and we can go in any direction or either direction that we want. So I always give an example. For instance, Walmart could think that, with the next big thing is going to be self-driving cars. And then technically they could start developing a self-driving car, firing their employees, hiring a bunch of engineers. Let's assume that they succeed in designing that self-driving car. Then, of course, nobody wants to drive a Walmart car around. So they have to rebrand it, and then technically they're a different company. So the question for a supermarket like that would actually be, what can we do with something like autonomous technology? And there's other solutions and there's other directions that fit what their corporate DNA or their heritage is. And we map these possibilities for organizations and help them to identify those questions and help them to see new possibilities in that future. The result of our work, and I've talked to a client of ours, if I can share kind of like some of the stuff that we've been doing for them, and they've agreed to do that. So I'm not going to name their name, but I'll show kind of like the work that we've been doing with them. This is an example of what we've done earlier this year, literally a map of future possibilities for this organization, where you see how we visualize and brought to life a future that they see for themselves. And it's literally a map, because this is a map of a zoo. And I'll dive into that a little bit later. And when you see at the bottom, you also see that there are these lines which are for this organization, their strategies. And you have all these dots on those lines, which are the stepping stones, the steps or the tactics or actions, whatever what you want to use for it, that they are going to execute upon in the future. So a couple of other questions or general questions that people regularly ask of us, just to give you a little bit of a feeling of the type of work that we do. This top question is usually the question that organizations ask of us. What is our industry going to look like in the future? And of course, always the question that follows, what does it mean for our organization if it's changing? But we also have questions around how people become future ready. I don't really like the word future proof, because I think that that is almost kind of like resisting the future. Whereas I think that you have to embrace the future, you have to let it in. So we rather talk about future ready. How can you become future ready? How can you as an organization be adaptable to change or sensitive for change? Usually is that question. Another question, how can we have more impact on society? Speculative futures, of course, comes in here quite regularly, where speculative futures, for many of you on the call who know this already, is more about, how can we create a better world? How can we create a more sustainable future? And how can we tackle some of the societal challenges that are facing us? And this question is asked of us quite regularly as well, because there are a lot of organizations that truly want to have a positive impact on society, because of course you can also read that negatively. Can you help us make a plan for the future? That's usually a follow-up question after we've explored what is possible in the future. People want to translate it into a course of action so that they can start building stuff around it. And then finally, can you train our employees to think differently? In our work, we present people with a perspective on, well, actually their current position, but a perspective on change. And that involves kind of to even think in futures. And I think for a lot of people, they see the future as just one directional kind of like line that is extrapolating from the past. But the future, of course, can never be a prediction. So we talk about futures, and the S that is added there is already a different way of seeing the world and a different way of thinking about what is possible. And many of our clients ask us, can you help us to train our employees to think like that, to see these possibilities, to think in alternative scenarios, and then based on that, design a new course into the future, or new products and plans and services. Specific, and then these are questions that have actually been a little bit more specific. So that first question, what does our industry look like in the future? What does the zoo of 2032 look like? I showed you the image before that came from that question. How can we become future ready? One of our clients asked us, how can we become a company of disruptors? Because they wanted to learn how to disrupt themselves so that they could be ready for alternative futures or competition perhaps in the future. How can we increase vegetable consumption? One of our clients is focusing on that to increase kind of like the health in society. And how can you make that happen? How can you change that kind of like extrapolation of a trend into a trend disruption, a very significant change? Can you help us make a plan for the future? Well, one of our clients asked us to craft an investment plan for them. They had a great idea to go in a different direction, but they needed to have the argument in place to get the money on board. And we helped them to develop kind of like this future vision that they could then present to their investors and get going with their idea. Can you train our employees to think differently? Well, can you train our employees to take more risks? We did this for a big oil company, which is usually designed around avoiding risk because they work on these oil rigs, for instance. But if you want to innovate and if you want to become a more sustainable oil company, and I know that that sounds crazy, but they're actually working towards that, then you have to experiment, then you have to take more risk, and then you have to embrace failure as well. So that was a question that was asked of us, and we designed a program and approach around that for them. These are questions, these are things that we help clients with. And of course, at least one of the questions that I saw in the sign-up form from people is, how do you do that? How do you as Minkowski approach these questions, and what is your philosophy, or what is your methodology that you use for it? We call it applied futures, because it's nice to think about these inspirational dream type of futures. And you know, there's a lot happening there. I think that science fiction is very often already kind of like a signal for what might happen in the near future. But in our work, when you work for organizations and companies that want to do something with it, you always have to make sure that you're able to apply that inspiration or the insights into your daily practice. That's why we call it applied futures thinking. And I'm sure that many of you recognize this image. I took this from a colleague of ours, Stuart Candy of CMU, because he crafted it so nicely. And this is an illustration of when you think about futures, when you think about all these different scenarios, that there's always the things that are possible. And as I explained, there might be many more things possible in the future than is applicable to an organization. But of course, it's not so much about what is just possible, but as you see those cones getting smaller and smaller, you have to find what is really plausible for you in the future so that you can design a preferable path, and then eventually you end up in the smallest cone there, which is what is probably going to happen. Now, this is a depiction of futures thinking and future scenario thinking, where the illustration clearly shows that what you eventually end up with is much smaller in bandwidth than what is the potential that is out there in the world. The thing that we have done with something like this and these cones is to turn that into an approach or a process or steps that you can follow to get from the world of possibility to what is the most likely course of action for your organization if you wish to end up in that future. And of course, we map that with the work of Herman Minkowski. And then that looks like this. You remember this graph, I showed you that before as the cone of possibility of Minkowski. And the first step in our process is always the question, what is possible? And you have to awaken yourself and you have to awaken your organization for these possibilities. So we work a lot with scientists and experts, scholars it could be in the field of technology, but it's also in the field of society, of philosophy, basically to open the mind of organizations and people in the organizations. Then the second question comes, what is plausible for you? So on that axis, you identify what you want to accomplish in the future. What are the beliefs that you have that you want to follow? And also, what are your limiting beliefs? What are the thoughts that you have that keep you in the position that you are in today? And you have to be able to distinguish between the two and then choose where you want to go, because that is plausible for you to achieve in that ocean of possibilities. And the third question, from that position in the future, we start reasoning backwards. Like, what is your preferable course that you want to take? And we always approach that from the future, reasoning back until you get to where you are today. So never from, well, we are here today and now what is going to happen. First, you have to design that path, design a strategy around it so that you can identify what is the first step that we can take. And we do this because very often that first step is always, of course, the most important step. But you very often get blinded by the chaos around you at this point to see what the right step in the right direction is. So that's why we start from the future. And of course, the last question then is, what is then the most probable cause of action to do? Now you see in this depiction how those cones are getting smaller and smaller because we get closer to the point of now. And that is, of course, where the bandwidth is less than at the end of that cone. So you have those versions of the futures from the possible, the plausible, the preferable, and probable in here as well, but designed in a process so that you can follow along a trajectory with the clients in taking these steps. And it starts with this. I've explained before the example of Walmart that your cone of possibility and what you can accomplish in the future is very much determined by where you came from and where you are today. So the first step in our process is always, who are you? Now let's take that zoo example. This is not the zoo that we did the work for, but this is a zoo that's close to most of people on the call, I think, at the Los Angeles Zoo. So what we do, we engage at first, that's why we call it step 0, with a deep inquiry. What is the business that you are in? Or maybe we should phrase that better. What is the business you think you are in? Where are you coming from? What is happening in your organization at this moment? That deep inquiry is a first step in the process. It's almost like an intake or a baseline that you kind of like craft with the organization. And that gets you from, that past to that point of the now. Now, interestingly, like I said, knowing where you come from and where you are today already gives you a glimpse of the future. And I could illustrate it like this. You could extend certain paths and bandwidths going forward. But of course, this is just a very slimmer of what's really possible in the future. But every engagement that we have starts with that question, who are you? So that is the question that we wanted to ask of you all as well, with the first polling question. And maybe Joris, you can activate that poll. Who are you? Well, it's a poll, right? So you have to pick one of these alternatives there, and let's see who we have on this call. A lot of designers so far. Nice. Okay. So there's a lot of, as it appears to be, a lot of designers on this call, a lot of people that are working on crafting these futures, I hope, or perhaps products and services for people as well. Nice. So that is a first step. We now know who's in the call and we know who you are. So that was the first question. If you want, you can kind of like close that pop-up window so that you might have a better view of the slides. Let me continue with the story to the next step. We first start that exercise, if you remember, with, was there a question somewhere? With a question like, what is possible in the futures? And we do this by crafting what-if scenarios with people. The tool that we use, we've called that Radar for the Future. Usually we do a World Cafe type of setup. I don't know if you're familiar with that hosting method, but we put people around a table and present them with questions. We present them with possibilities in the future, and we deliberately try to formulate those questions because we expect them to be outside of the cone of possibility, if you remember that. Based on kind of like our baseline, who are you? We design a couple of questions, scenarios, and of course, we present that with technologies, for instance, or with evidence, so you will, and present them with questions like this, for instance. So looking at the zoo as an example, what if a zoo doesn't have animals anymore? And then we have people map out and discuss what would happen then to your zoo if you don't have animals. Second question, what if a zoo doesn't have cages anymore? What if it's not perhaps a physical location? What would you do? And a third question in this particular project was, what if a zoo doesn't have employees anymore? These questions and these scenarios came from the intake that we did with them. And it was meant to kind of like, travel to the boundaries of what will be possible for this organization. Now, of course, when you present these questions to them, their initial response is always, that's impossible. We cannot have a zoo without animals, or we cannot have a zoo without cages, or we cannot have a zoo without employees. But the trick, of course, when you engage in a process like that and a co-creative exercise with them, is to have them travel to those positions in the future. Let's just imagine that you don't have animals. What would it look like? Because if you identify that, you get to the core of what is important for, in this example, the zoo. So that's brought us to broaden the bandwidth of that cone of possibility. We stretched them beyond what they were currently thinking because they came with ideas that were outside of that slimmer of who they were or who they thought they were. But with these questions, we've created a bigger bandwidth for them. to think outside of the box, perhaps. It's a catchphrase that doesn't really work that well, but you get the point, so that we wanted to broaden it up. So now that you've extended that cone of possibility and they're thinking more in possibilities that they've never thought of before, you can engage in the next step of that process, of course. Now, we also wanted to present you with a question like this, to think perhaps a little bit outside of your current cone of possibility looking into the future. What if COVID-19 is with us for the next 5 years? So it's not going to disappear after the summer. We will not find a vaccine. What if this is going to happen? And maybe, Joris, you can activate the second poll question for people. Again, you can pick two apparently in this question. What if COVID-19 is with us for another 5 years? What will happen then? If you can put your votes in to see what happens here. So the world has changed and adapted to deal with it. Most people are voting for that, I guess. And I will have changed my life fundamentally. So it's interesting to see from this question that you either think that you are going to adapt and change, or that the world will find ways to adapt to a change like that, or a fact or effective life like that. We'll get back to the poll later on. And by the way, we'll share kind of like the results of all the polls later on and after the call, maybe, so that you can look at what people voted for. So we've extended a little bit the boundaries of what is possible in our example in a world of COVID-19 in the next 5 years. So back to our example of the zoo. We focused on the plausible scenarios next. We use a tool called Stories for Change. These are actual results from the session that we did. We can dive into that maybe later on, what that tool is, but it's an exercise where you're able to craft a narrative for the future that you envision for your organization. So it uses storytelling techniques, but it also uses a lot of abductive reasoning to build a logic structure, to truly identify what is the crisis that we're in today. If you see there on one of those pictures, which is the moment that you're in now, where does that come from? And if you know where it comes from, what are some of the problems and challenges that you face, then you can flip the coin, so to speak, and focus on the future and end up with the change, as you see one of those last pieces of the pie there. And the way that you do this, and maybe you can see it in one of the pictures at the bottom there, it says an arrow that moves up. That is the way that you reason about it. So you basically pull back the layers of complexity for it. But the way that you share that story, and you see that in the left picture that I've added there, you tell it kind of like clockwise, so to speak. And it's an exercise where you craft this narrative, where you craft this argumentation for what is plausible, or what you think is plausible for your future. And as you can see, we've done this for this organization in 3 different perspectives here, 3 different scenarios. And of course, what you do after that is you compare these scenarios, you compare these perspectives to identify what are elements in our argumentation that pop out all the time, because those elements that are similar in all these scenarios, those are the things that are prominent in the future for an organization. That was that question, and I've illustrated that because it's almost like you kind of like pinpoint a couple of positions in the future, and you start crafting these narratives around to truly start to believe in, yes, it is possible to get there. This is my argument for how we can make it happen. So let's bring in the next poll question of yours. We're in this world of COVID-19 lasting for more than 5 years. What do you think is most likely to change permanently if we're in that world? And we've given you a couple of options for this question here. What will have changed permanently? You can pick 2 again. the way we work. Nice. So most of you think that the way we work will change, and of course we've experienced that change in the recent months as we were all kind of like forced to work from home, I guess. And also the fabric of cities is the runner-up in this overview, which is interesting. And maybe those two are connected somehow as well, because if we change the way we work and we don't have to get to the office all the time, then maybe we could also move outside of cities and do our work from there. And that would then, of course, change the fabric of cities. Now, this is just an illustration on how that argumentation, that storage for change tool that I've just shown could work, and how you can connect kind of like a reasoning structure around that. The third step, that is the step where you are moving back to the present. We do that. We call that strategy design because we use design thinking methodologies to craft kind of like a strategy. And the tool that we use, and perhaps some of you are familiar with that, is Hoshin Kanri, which comes from Japan. And it's a way of strategic planning that almost, well, I always explain it as a Matryoshka model. I don't know if you know those dolls that have smaller dolls inside and smaller dolls and smaller dolls until you have a very tiny small doll inside. That's a Matryoshka doll, as they call it. And it's interesting because they're all linked together in that statue of the doll. But that is also our way of designing strategy, where you have this overall vision on the future, the speculation that you made there, and you've identified kind of like what is plausible for you. Now it gets down to what are our strategic actions that we're going to take and what is happening. So let's take a very big organization, what is happening for the top management and how they have identified kind of like their strategies becomes kind of like a vision for the departments that fall underneath that. Now, this is what a model like that looks like, where you see in the upper three horizontal layers, it says vision, mission, and status quo. We've done this for Dutch clients, so you cannot read what it says there. But that is the overall vision that we've developed for this client. Then underneath there, you have your strategic goal and the objective. Like, how do you measure kind of like what you're doing? And then you see kind of like these three kind of like layers to the right side at the bottom, which are three strategic horizons that you identify. And of course, you can operationalize them more to tactics, etc., etc. And as you can see, and that's why I enclose these pictures, this is not something where we are kind of like creating it for them, or we have a nice deck and say, well, this is the vision and this should be your strategy. This is something that we are crafting bottom up. We do this with design questions. We do this with all the other practices that you know of design thinking. And we have them kind of like do these exercises where they answer these questions. And then at the end of the process, we are basically putting everything as a puzzle in this form. And then they've journeyed from that far future and they've translated it into design questions to get to actions. And in the illustration of the cone of possibility, this is actually what the process then looks like, right? It's a preferable course that you want to accomplish. You reason from that future and you go back and back and back till you identify what the first step is there. So a question for you all with a poll that Joris can activate. If we are in that future, COVID-19, and if we think that some of these things are going to change very fundamentally, then who needs to take the first step? Which actor in society should go first? Nice. Nice. Well, I really like this because it puts the burden of change on us citizens, right? That we can have our powers in these democracies to make a change happen. This is very often a discussion that we have with our clients as well. depending on what the client is, but we do a lot of public work as well. We work for governments as well. And of course, governments also say, well, it's the citizens that also have a say in this. And corporate organizations, especially when it comes down to kind of like these sustainable changes for the future, very often say that the government has to put in regulations and then we'll abide by the rules. Or consumers are buying my products. I'm just delivering what they're asking for. And of course, those debates are quite fierce. And it's interesting for this group, at least, to see that you hold your citizenship dear to your heart to make these changes happen. Last step for now in this process, step 4, how do you design that first step? Well, we use business modeling and road mapping. As you can see there with a brown paper on that wall, we do that bottom up as well, where we have participants in a strategic session identify all the tactics, all the steps that they think that have to happen, and we map that all out. And as you can see, you can then also translate that in an investment roadmap. Now, this is a very important step here, because this is the point where you can actually make the first step very tangible, and you have to get yourself to that point of action, and you have to do that with an organization, because if they don't identify what the first step is, then they will never engage with it. They will never make that first step. And of course, that first step has to make sense from an investment perspective as well. So you also have to, you cannot just say, this is a step that you have to make. You have to create kind of like from that side, a financial sustainable model around it as well for them, which is what we've done for this client as well. Well, that's the last step in that graph there. And of course, if you move then up in the spectrum with the next step, then your cone starts shifting as well. We don't believe that you can predict the future, but you can take these first step, and these first step will put kind of like that system in motion, and then things will change and you can course correct when you go there. That is why you've created, and that is why you've explored that cone of possibility and mapped what might happen there, so that when it happens, you can interact with it and engage with it much more. So, final question then for you all, using the poll. If that is happening, then what are you going to do yourself in the change in the COVID-19 world that lasts for longer than we've expected? You can pick 2, as it says there. What would you go and do? Well, it's fascinating to see that. I think that the top one there, change my lifestyle and prepare for it, is probably the most difficult answer that you could pick, because it's so difficult, 1, to change your lifestyle, but then 2, to do that in a way that you are prepared for uncertainty. I think that means that you have to let go of a lot of things that you're used to. So it's just an interesting dynamic, I think, on this group that is present in this call, how you see the changes that you would like to, or that you're willing to do in the future. So get back to the example, the zoo of 2032. Wanted to bring back that visual that I've shown you before. This is actually the map of the zoo that they had, and they wanted to kind of like redesign the whole thing. And you could see some of kind of like the ideas, the possibilities that they saw in that future. At the bottom, again, you see these 3 strategic horizons that came from that Hoshin Kanri sheet. And of course, with all the individual actions plotted against time and investment there, as you can see. And of course, we've also added that in more business-like format, where you have that digital version of the Hoshin Kanri sheet. Now, they can hand this out to their organization, and every department understands what they have to do, because they have that visual depiction of a speculation of the future, because this is just ideas, right? This is not reality. And they have kind of like the plan in place there on how to activate that future and how to go about that. And every single piece of that radar in the zoo understands what they have to do to turn that into reality. And of course, they have to course correct that every time. Now, you know what we do, you know how we do, and of course, the biggest question, and I saw a lot of that in the questions that you handed in the sign-up form, is why do we do it? Well, we strongly believe that we are on a road to more sustainability. We've crafted this as an image for it. This comes from our research, where we see that there is a technological driver that is creating these marker points in the future. Where we go from a blurring of boundaries with all these technologies and possibilities to a networked society. I think that we're somewhere in between there, leading to a world of smart living. And then finally, at a far edge, something that we call a quantum society. Now, I'm not going to dig into kind of like what this all means, but this usually services from the observations that we've done with the people that we work with, the experts and scholars, but also from the work that we've done with the people in organizations, because people in organizations are individuals. They are citizens as you are as well. They also want to change the world. And if you're able to tap into that collective intelligence, if you're able to co-create these futures with them, then it, in my experience, almost becomes impossible for them not to take that road towards more sustainability. Because if you want your business to be there in a decade or in 20 years, then the world also has to be there. So I think that these two more and more get aligned with each other. That is at least the belief that we have, and that is the belief that we have in all the work that we do. Just then finally, a couple of tools to show you that we use. That radar for the future, as you've seen, we do that in a World Cafe style, but we work a lot with visual artists that then visualize some of that work, and it becomes much more of a radar screen where things pop out. This is something that we've actually created yesterday for a new initiative that we're launching. Moonshots, moonshot thinking is part of our practice as well. And I should add loonshot to that as well. I don't know if you've read that book, but it's not just about kind of like the big and bold going to the moon type of ideas. It's also the quirky ideas and the ideas that don't get all the attention because they're so big and bold. It's also the crazy ideas that you need for it. But specifically for that moonshots, we've developed an app that people can use and that you can use in companies and organizations with massive participants to identify what you would want to accomplish with your organization and solve some of these sustainable development goals. This is that sheet that I've shown before, a Stories for Change tool, where you are able to craft kind of like your logical reasoning on the left side and then translate that into a story outline on the right side as well, so that you can share it with the people in your organization or your families back home. And interestingly, we've been doing this work for quite a while. So we've created this booklet which holds these scenarios that companies and organizations that we've worked with have crafted over the years. We've anonymized them, but collected them in the Stories for Change handbook as a source of inspiration for people on how some of these industries are seeing the future going forward. And here's the Ocean Cannery strategy outline sheet. You can find this online as well. It's an open source tool and approach. There are many books written about it, but here you have that depiction of all those elements. And what's so attractive to this sheet is that companies and organizations always have the feeling that, all right, I have everything, I have the plan on one piece of paper. And that gives them a sense of commitment and engagement and kind of a conviction that they can make it happen. So what's next? This is a question that was asked in the sheet as well. How can we collaborate with you? What can we do to get into this field? I just wanted to share a couple of things that we are doing at the second half of this year, which is all open for participation for people and organizations. If you want to do something individually, we've launched a reset program, which is about kind of like what you've experienced in the COVID-19 period and how you can reset yourself for the future. The tools that you saw and that I've presented will then be applied to your personal life, because a story for change can also be applied to a personal life. This is an initiative that we're starting with Columbia University, again, the School of the Arts. Lance Weiler is a close collaborator from us with years. We've called it Restart Your Business, an industry perspective. And it's a lab that we're running in August 27 and 28. And when you participate in that, you even get a statement of accomplishment of Columbia University. So if you want to do that, I think that the applications, I don't know if they're opening today, but if you go to that URL, you get the information, and then I can send you the application form to sign up for that. And then finally, we run a program called Reboot Your Organization, which is geared towards organizational restructuring, where you are going to map out kind of like 3 possible scenarios for your organization, which is where you can find them. One more thing. You all know this catchline, right? We really appreciate your feedback on this, aside from all the questions that we'll dive into, but we'll put a URL for a feedback form in the chat window. And if you could please fill that out with your comments, we'd really appreciate that. And to give you a little reward for that, if you do that, then we'll send you a booklet, that booklet that I presented of the Stories for Change, which contains kind of like these industry scenarios that have been crafted over the years of our work. So please give us that feedback. I guess that's it, yes. Ronni, let me hand it back to you. I hope that I didn't extend too much of it for questions.
Yeah, that was so fantastic, Jorgen. Thank you. I mean, it was really great to have you walk us through a little bit of the process as we're going through and answering questions. I think that helped make it, that helped kind of bring it to life in a different way. So I know that one of the questions that many people have asked, and so I'm just going to jump right into it. And then if there are people who have questions as we're speaking, please go ahead and throw them into the chat, and we'll try to address those also. So one of the things that people were really interested in knowing is, how do you sell this into clients? So who are the businesses or organizations that you have found to be most open and or interested in this kind of work? Do they approach you, or do you approach them, or how does that typically happen for you?
Well, most of the clients approach us, and they come kind of like as a word of mouth to us. I think that, this is my belief, I think that every organization can use kind of like these types of techniques. Because the only thing that you can be sure of is that change is everywhere, and the world is always changing. And if you want to set yourself up to be sensitive or adaptable to those changes, then a good starting point is to think about the future and just imagine what could be. Because if you have a better image or a vision, not the vision in kind of like the very holistic type of way, but literally kind of like an image of the future, then it becomes something that you can talk about, that you can interact around, and that you can design strategy around it. So every organization is fit for it. And I think that the trick, I don't know if it's really a trick, but is to engage with clients and ask them those questions. Ask them what they think is going to change. Ask them how the past has changed, right? I think that the balancing act between futures thinking and what has happened to people and organizations in the past is where kind of like you find the dynamic of change. And when people look back at their organizations and where they come from, they can immediately see how it's changed. Now, the question, I think, for many organizations then becomes, how is it going to change going forward? So we always engage in a conversation around that first. Without selling them kind of like a session or something like that, just a conversation on, how do you see the world changing? What do you think is important for your organization? And then the rest follows. And we also get approached very often to help people with a session or a meeting or something like that, something very small, And I think that that is a first kind of a connection point as well, because we always reason from the future. The future doesn't have to be 5, 10, or 20 years out. The future is also next week, or the future is also at the end of this meeting. Where do you want to end up at the end of the meeting? And then work your way backwards. So I think that you can easily weave in kind of like that futures thinking perspective without going straight away to speculative futures and creating these great pieces of design that are very stimulating for people to engage in conversation around that. So small steps first and engage in conversation, I think, is the best approach.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. That kind of leads into Julie. Let's see, Larry, I think, had a question here. Larry, are you still on? He might have dropped off.
No, I'm still on. Hello.
Oh, there you are. Oh, hey, Larry.
Sorry.
You want to ask?
Larry.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, you want me to ask it? I texted. I'm sorry. I've been doing this a while, and I find when I use future forward techniques that you sometimes, run out of runway, that you can't really see out far enough to really know what the future is. So trying to use a blending of future back and future forward, just had better luck. So I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and when you say future back, what do you mean specifically with that?
Going out, like, let's say I did it 10 years ago, like projecting out and saying, oh, battery technology is going to allow electric cars to exist, or having a smartphone might enable you to do things more than talk and text. Things like that.
Yeah.
And then working backwards from there.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. I think that is a good way of approaching it. We use a lot of exercises where we try to identify what we call second generation effects of technologies. So it's not just about kind of, and this is just an example, right? Technology, but to identify not only kind of like this is a technology that does this, but then try to extrapolate going forward. So when that happened, what is the next thing that might happen?
Exactly.
And what is the next thing that might happen?
Right.
Because that usually kind of like gets you a little bit more imaginative, and you need that at first.
Okay, good.
I think, and I think that ideation techniques work brilliantly for that as well. Just engage in an exercise where people can throw out crazy ideas, which is something very effective. And one exercise that I always like, we call that magazine cover of the future. We usually give organizations and people in organizations an assignment to literally craft a magazine cover where we set them up. You've become the most successful person or organizations in 25 years' time. And an article is written about your success. Now you have to design the cover of the magazine to sell it in a kiosk. What does the magazine cover look like? And we give them a couple of kind of like prompts that they have to put in there. And that gets them kind of like in that futures thinking perspective as well. And because it's creative and quirky, that kind of like opens them up more than kind of like getting your analysis and your data and research and stuff like that, because that is, well, it's valuable, but it's sometimes also boring, and it doesn't stimulate creativity.
Perfect. Thank you. That was a great answer. Thank you.
There's a lot more questions that are coming up. I wanted to, maybe I'll just combine or sort of thread together a couple of them. So there's a couple of questions here, Jörgen, about constraints. And I think you just spoke to that a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more. So one of the questions is, how do you deal with the constraints of your own perspectives? And how is it that you actually gather the signals and trends or things that are happening in a way that allows you to be really productive in thinking about the future? And then the other constraint has to do with the future versus now. And, how is it that you manage sort of those two spaces? And I think you've said, you've spoken to that a little bit in terms of starting small and going with the next step. But I think that's a question that even in its description, a lot of people have a hard time kind of overcoming.
Well, to start with that first question, when we design programs, we at least, I mean, it depends on the client, of course, but we one, always try to have a group that is as diverse as possible. So never just kind of like the top management, always kind of like a cross section of an organization, because, you know, somebody at the call center might have a completely different perspective on what consumers value than the top management of an organization. And that interaction between the layers in an organization, usually when you set that up and when there's a safe space for people to engage in conversation, then that stimulates kind of like a different perspective as well. So that is one thing that we do. We also very often include scientists or experts from different fields. So a biologist to talk about resilience in nature as kind of like a challenger in a conversation or a client question about how can we become more resilient for the future. Because that different perspective kind of like literally taps into a different part of your brain, and then kind of like these things unlock. And then the third thing that we sometimes do is to do these role play type of things. And when I say that, and when I suggest that to clients, I always get kind of like these role play, and is this with actors and stuff like that? No, it doesn't have to be kind of like with actors, but it's just kind of like to set you up in a position that you then have to advocate for, or that you then have to reason from. You just get a role as a consumer or as a client or something in the future, and you just kind of like really live that. And I think that if you set that up right, that can change kind of like the perspective of people in a group completely around. So that kind of like sometimes gets you over these constraints that you're always thinking the same things. And one last thing that I throw in there is that all our programs are designed around questions. So we spend a lot of time on formulating what questions are we going to ask. And we do a lot of exercises where people have to come up with more questions. And what's so beautiful about that, that questions are open, and good questions have kind of like this innate nature to be a desire to want to answer it, to be answered. And I think that that also can get you kind of like around some of these constraints. You don't have to always talk in statements and opinions and facts, but just have a conversation when you're only, in which you're only allowed to ask questions. That opens kind of like a conversation space as well.
I love that. Nobody knows we only have questions. Let's start there.
Exactly.
There's a lot more questions. So I just want to be conscious of the time. So we're at the top of the hour. I want to make just a couple quick announcements in case anyone's going to leave us, and then we'll continue on with questions if you guys want to stay on. I think, Jörgen, you have a little...
Sure. I have more time.
Okay, so I just wanted to mention for anyone who's in LA and part of our Speculative Futures LA group that we do have a new group of co-organizers. I'm just going to mention their names really quickly here, but then we'll send a newsletter out with more information about everyone. So if you guys just want to raise your hand real quick, it's Jay Goldstock, Sohrab Nimsakar, Dave Roselle, and Ioana. I don't know if you're on, Ioana Sutiru. I hope I said your last name right. So you're going to hear a lot. Okay, great. There you are.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Great talk.
Yes, I know. So amazing. We're not done yet. Lucky us. So you're going to hear a lot more from us over the next few weeks. And so I just wanted to mention that very quickly. And also our next event is going to be on July 21st, I believe, with Trisha Williams, who's going to talk to us about world building in gaming and building community. And so they received a grant to do a 20-year world building project with communities in Kansas City. But they also have a deep background in gaming. And so it will be super interesting. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I see people are saying goodbye to us. So thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to fill out this form for feedback on the talk if you want to get this Stories for Change booklet, which I have, and it's amazing. Okay. So just a brief pause to make announcements. Thanks again, everyone who came. If you have to go, we just love having you here, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for the next. Okay, so back to the questions for Jörgen. So Jörgen, there's also been a lot of questions around, just to sort of jump back to you, around this idea of justice, of humanity, you know, I think there's a lot of anxiety around how do you do the right thing? How do you make sure that change is going in the right direction and not the wrong direction? I know a lot of people in this country feel this way. And so what would you say to that? Especially, and I kind of want to add on to that, like, you know, your perspective for this work being based in Europe, in Amsterdam, but having worked in the US as well.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that a couple of things are important to, or there's a couple of things that you can do to make sure that whatever comes out of a futures thinking type of process or a speculative futures type of process is to truly connect with the people, with the, I mean, empathy and building a true and meaningful connection between participants, and to illustrate that these participants, when they're employees in sometimes organizations that, for instance, are in oil and gas, I mean, there are people there. And if you are able from the start to point them at their humanity, then they will start to reason from that position. If you step over that, so if you start with a process and you start with, well, this is the company challenge and this is kind of like our tactics, blah, 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 then you take away a lot of their humanness, if that's a word, from these individuals that are in the place. So what we always do at the start of a program is to first have people engage in a meaningful personal conversation with each other, which is almost always about why are you here? Why are you engaging in this conversation? And we do an exercise 5 times why. Perhaps some of you have engaged in that before. And that exercise is designed in a way that you cannot stick with your superficial answers. It really taps into kind of like a deeper motivation for being there. And I think that building that empathy, building those relationships with people to address them at their humanness is a very important step if you want to avoid ending up in these negative future scenarios. So that is one thing that we always do. The second thing that we always, I mean, you as a facilitator or as a consultant or however you want to call yourself, you also have an ethical compass, right? So there are kind of like moments in a session where you just have to make a point and you just have to and it's always difficult, right? Because it feels that you're engaging in conflict with people that want to steer things in a certain direction that you don't believe in. But I think it is crucial for society to engage in those types of conversations. So when you feel that yourself, don't avoid that conversation, don't avoid that conflict, but go to it, address it, because it is also a way of learning how to interact sometimes around very difficult issues that surface in these sessions. So always having that conversation and steering on your personal moral compass, I think is very important there. And like I said, I think, you know, building a sustainable business also means that you have to take care of the world around you, because if the world's not there, your business is not going to be there. And we kind of like emphasize that very often in the work that we do. So the example that I shared on the zoo, I mean, there's a lot of issues, of course, on animal welfare, on what people and these owners of zoos are doing there, and if that is even what you should be doing to animals. Now, then there is one way, you know, that you can react and say, well, I don't engage with that client because I don't believe in what they're doing. But the other way is that you engage in a conversation with them and you try to get them to a position where they're changing their course, even if it's just 1 degree maybe, and that might feel like a very small change, but that is where it starts. And in that specific project that we run for them, we've actually been able to help them to craft a path to the future that might for them eventually result in a zoo with no animals. But they've done that then kind of like sustainably for them as well, right? So that they can have kind of like a sustainable life or a sustainable business model. But they've almost educated their visitors then in that direction. I think that is a responsibility that you can help people with. So those are some of the things that we do to stay on that path towards more sustainability.
I love that. I love the focus on that because I feel like there's always, like when you ask questions and you've got a framework of sustainability ahead of you, it gives you somewhere to go. And I think that's something that people are often wondering about, like where do you, they get kind of worried about getting lost in this future. But I think good questions and good frameworks really help with that. So I don't know that I have, so for the questions that I have already addressed, if you guys have additional ones or follow-ups, feel free to throw them in here. I think we have time for maybe just like one or two more questions. So the one I haven't addressed yet, let's see. Daniel, you asked earlier. Do you want to go ahead and ask that question?
Yeah, I can. Well, I'm currently trying to add this set of skills and tools and methodologies to my professional practices as a consultant, as a designer too, and I don't actually know how to sell this, but you answered that. But how can I maybe design or do a portfolio to show to new clients or to prospect with companies the futures thinking? I after this workshop, this webinar, I have a vision, but I wanted to know more tips or more practices from you.
Well, I think, having kind of like a plan for yourself helps, of course, and I'm glad to hear that you're working on that. But I think what is important is that you can show for what you are able to do. So what I would suggest is that you kind of like find these assignments, and I mean, there's a lot of things happening that are in the public sector that are NGOs, and they're kind of like open to the public, and you just kind of like, step into those spaces, do your work there, do your speculative design work there, because that builds your portfolio, and it builds a portfolio that is kind of like rooted in reality. Because you could, of course, also kind of like build a portfolio and, you sit behind your computer and you start to create all this stuff. But that is usually more a testament of your design skills than it is a testament of what you're able to do when you work with a group on a very real problem that they have. So what I would do is kind of like seek out kind of like these types of opportunities, because these initiatives are always or very often at least, with the heart at the right place. They're very often bootstrapped, so that they don't have any funds, and they would welcome kind of like anyone that can help them out to make that future more tangible for the participants. And that is a way of building kind of like these examples in your portfolio for you. That is something that I would do, and that is something that we've done as well, and that we are continuing to do as well. Like I said, it's not just the moonshots, but the loon shots. So sometimes you have to seek out these obscure, quote unquote, places, because interesting stuff is happening there, and you can help people kind of like in engaging in those types of conversations. And it builds a portfolio and it builds relations, and that is what you need, I think, if you're starting out on that.
Thank you.
There are a couple of follow-ups to that. I think Daniel and Christine are both wondering, do you guys want to ask the question? Daniel, you're shaking your head.
Nope, I'm fine.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Daniel Martin's fantastic. And then there's Daniel Chit.
Now, essentially, the other Daniel's questions answered mine. I mean, it phrased it, but then mine was essentially about having a degree in this, and then like it's difficult to find. Well, I've been having difficulty finding a job with this degree, but then essentially it does involve a portfolio, as Martin's mentioned. But then, what other advice would you give?
Well, I think that there's a lot of online great communities that you can hook up to as well. I think that this community is interesting, and you know, the collection of people here, you might end up kind of like identifying a couple of projects together that you can collaborate upon. I'm always a fan because we do a lot of collaborations with them as well. The Digital Storytelling Lab of Columbia University with Lance Pilot there, which is how Ronni and I got connected. I think there's great projects that they run there. You can easily connect to that. They run meetups as well to connect to that. So yeah, I mean, I think it is finding these opportunities for yourself, and of course, also, I mean, you also have to be a little bit bold and have guts to do it. You know, like I said, I've been doing this work for quite a while, but at the start, you know, I ended up in situations where I thought, well, I don't know if I can make this happen. I don't know what, but you know, you just do it. And you just do whatever kind of like feels right at that time. And if you stay true to yourself, then you never can go wrong. And I think that having the guts to do it, having the confidence that it doesn't have to be perfect at first, that you kind of like just steer a group of people to an end, whatever that end is, and that end doesn't have to be a perfect end. Right? It has to be a sense of accomplishment. So I think that having the guts and being bold enough to do something like that. And sometimes you promise stuff that you don't know how to make it happen. And then you find like-minded people, as is in this group, and you seek their help. Kind of like, I've got this kind of like project, or I've got this assignment, I don't know how to finish it or how to go about it. And these people, which is interesting in this community, are always more than willing to help you out or give you a couple of tips and stuff like that.
Thank you.
That's such fantastic advice. I think that we will have one more question, Jörgen, and then we're going to be at the end of our time here. So Mark, you've
Sure.
been kind of waiting patiently. Are you still there? I see you. I don't know if you are able to ask your question or if you've moved away. Mark Siwu? No? Okay. He's
What was his question? We're still recording, right? You can
That's true. So his question, that's true. We'll tell him to go back. So his question was how to identify the stakeholder for the speculative design, which may not even exist, and what parameters we take to quantify the impact.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, what's interesting about speculative work and what's interesting about futures is that it is always, you can never have evidence for it. And which is, I think, something that distinguishes this practice from more traditional ways of consulting, for instance, where traditional ways of consulting are always about best practices, right? And identifying somewhere around the world or having the research, having all the evidence to back it up, kind of like this is the best practice to run your business. I think what we engage in our work is identifying these next practices. What are new ways of working? And there is no evidence for that. There is no kind of like data to back that up. It is just, that's why it's called speculative design, right? It's speculations on the future. So the same goes for kind of like identifying these stakeholders, because sometimes in the future, you might identify stakeholders that are not even present today or that you cannot engage with today. If you have that, I think that the best way to approach that is to start kind of like yourself with imagining what all the actors are and then reason your way back how you get there. Because I think that backwards backcasting type of way of exercise to tie it to today is very crucial, because otherwise it is just science fiction. And again, there's nothing wrong with science fiction. But if you want to do this work and make it applicable for organizations, you have to be able to identify a path towards it. And if you're able to identify that path towards it, then you also know which stakeholder to engage in that conversation right now. Because in your argumentation, you've made assumptions that this particular stakeholder is going to be important in the future as well. And then you engage in that conversation, and then eventually you might end up somewhere completely different, but that doesn't matter because it's about that conversation and the insight that you got from it. So I would always reason my way backwards, kind of like with that set of future stakeholders, how can I relate them back to today? And then who should I involve in that conversation?
I really love that approach, and it's stuck with me as I've learned more about your practice, this idea of reasoning backwards. You also, this thing that you say about, it's not about the best, we're not after the best practice, we're after the next practice. I kind of really love that. There's one more question that somebody threw out, so I think it's a great place to end it. The question was just, given all of the remote work and remote engagement that we've had to do, how has this influenced the way that you've been working? Do you have any tips or tools for people in terms of how to do these kinds of practices sort of virtually and remotely?
Well, I think that one thing that happened as a result of all of this is the willingness for people to do this online and digitally. We would have never been in this position if this COVID-19 lockdown type of situation wouldn't have happened. So it's a great jumpstart for working digitally, which has the added benefit that you can do it globally, as we are doing here today as well. You can literally bring in everyone from every part of the world in your session. And the tools that are out there that are really great, and I think that a lot of those tools have in their development kind of like sped up as well. We do a lot with Miro, because I think that that's a highly collaborative tool with literally a lot of space to experiment there. So that is a tool that we use. You also have something which is similar called Mural. Of course, Zoom calling as well. And what I also always tell people in this time frame, don't forget kind of like physical reality as well. I mean, you think kind of like that you have to do everything digitally, but you don't always have to do it digitally. So when we kind of like engage with people and we do these types of sessions online, we always also send them something physical. So we work with cards like, I don't know, it's always difficult, like with cards like this that you can just write upon. And you can photograph that, put that in a Miro board, for instance, but that physical kind of like action is what people still desire as well. So I think that blend between kind of like the digital and kind of like sending out kind of like physical tools to people, that is when you kind of like enhance the experience. And then is when it starts popping kind of like for people that they can collaborate online.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's so important not to forget that. Thank you so much for your amazing talk and for everything that you shared. That was incredibly generous. I think everyone really learned a lot and are gonna have a lot to think about. And so just a reminder to everyone, if you could please fill out that the feedback form, and that way you can also stay in touch with Jörgen and Joris and the rest of Minkowski, and you can be on their mailing list and just learn more about what they're doing as we continue to move forward in all of this. So thank you once again. I know it's getting very late over there. Thanks for hanging in there.
All right. It was great, great being here. Thanks for all the good questions and the nice conversation. And indeed, please stay in touch. And if you have questions or want to have tips and tricks on the work that you do, we're always more than welcome to help you out and share some of our thoughts with you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much again, and thanks for everyone who joined us. We'll look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.